Hello, I'm your adjunct instructor, Derek Cowell. Welcome to our History 102 class. In History 102 at our institution, as does other institutions, or as do other institutions, we split U.S. history chronologically at the end of the Civil War. And what they try to do is they try to select and organize data into collective themes, collective realities, that are tied to, ideological and institutional issues and realities that we experience today, and questions and problems that our society has today. And so they've decided from the area of 1865 to 1877 to have the Reconstruction of the Southern states constitute the first topic for the latter half of U.S. history. And I think that there's no denying its significance. So at the end of the Civil War, from 1861 to 1865, the North, this 11 southern states, as well as a rogue half state from Missouri, joined the Confederacy and left or seceded from the country. And Abraham Lincoln would not allow that to happen, right? Not without a fight. And so at any rate, they fought for 4 years. Long drawn-out fight, and there were many legacies left in the South to address at the end of this war. One being the fact that the states had to be reinstituted as states because technically they had left. So they were as if they were incorporated territories again and needed to reapply for statehood. And a second component to deal with was just the different legacies of Civil War, hatred toward the North, distrust toward the Republican Party and the federal government in the South. And then thirdly, at the very least, just to name three, race relations between white and African American Southerners, okay? And so there was a lot going on and a lot to deal with, a lot to tackle. But as far as what was attempted, there's so many variables at play, right? For one, I mean, even when you look at main actors of the Republican Party who controlled state governments in the South at the end of the Civil War, etc., you have to look into psychology with ulterior motives, and just it's messy. But what historians try to do is they try to categorize this time period into some type of theme, some type of conflict, some type of issue or problem that is kind of monolithic, and that's probably not very accurate to the reality of the messiness of everything at that time period. So that's what I wanted to convey first off in my argumentative assignment that I gave you. Is in the first two sections, right? Some people would have you believe that the Civil War was fought, right, as a crusade, as a moral crusade to end slavery in the South and to make the backward South become more progressive, like the North allegedly, right? And that the main issue that kind of triggered the slavery fight, if you will, predominantly, arguably, was the opening of the West, taking the West from Mexico, Louisiana Territory states, applying for statehood status, etc. And so now, right, what to do about these new Western states? Do they become slave friendly? Do they prohibit slavery? And boy, it opened up a can of worms, to say the least. And then some people contend that there were diplomatic ways by which civil war could have been avoided. Other people take more of an inevitable approach, that it was bound to happen, that the North and South had gone in two divergent directions, socially, economically, politically, culturally, etc., and that they were very different from the get-go because of demographics. You look back at certain writings and they convey the thesis that a lot of people from the cities of England, bourgeois people, moved to northern states, and a lot of gentrymen and poor white rural English men and women moved into the South. and establish their own folkways in the North and in the South. And so at any rate, with this number one, it tries to convey the argument. And please remember that all of these are deliberately slanted, argumentative, okay? I don't want you to take a single section at face value. I want you to be critical, all right? But number one tries to convey the image that this was a moral crusade, that there was a pretty strong dichotomy between a bourgeois, kind of progressive, modernized North and a backward, archaic, inequitable South, right? And remember, inequitable, that it's economically unfair, imbalanced, like there's an oligarchy of a few people ruling at the expense of everybody else, namely the planter class of slave owners in the South. And so at any rate, you have your heroes in this narrative known as the abolitionists. You have your heroes in the Republican Party known as the radical Republicans. And they forced, arguably, they forced the South and the Southern reps to have discourse, to have dialogue and debate on the slavery issue. And then again, the opening of the West opened up a can of worms as well, right? And so then when it was fought, you have the timely evolution, according to this court history of the U.S. Civil War, of Abraham Lincoln, that the guy just kind of comes around and morphs from being a somewhat indifferent, typical human being, a young adolescent at least, to being very civic-minded and being very altruistic and empathetic toward African Americans, to the point of looking at his death as a martyrdom, that suggesting that, you know, he went out on a limb so strongly for African Americans and to end slavery that it may have cost him his life, concerning the circumstances of his assassin. So at any rate, you have that. And so if that's the case, right, then you can continue that narrative at the end of the Civil War, when we get into Reconstruction here, and you could try to convey the North as well-meaning, progressive, trying to catch the South up to speed, right? But then you also have number two here to give you some context. And number two, right, really highly challenges the court history of the Civil War. Remember, court history is like when a king or queen asks his or her court scribe to write a history of him or her. That court scribe is going to conveniently select and conveniently leave out certain facts and data, and present them and organize those facts in such a way that pretty much justifies, right, everything that king or queen did, and makes that king or queen depicted in a very positive light. That's what American court history does, is it praises those who were in control, who won, so to speak, politically, gained and maintained power, maybe even got to determine what type of governmental system, so hence won politically, economically gained a lion's share of resources and wealth, and maybe even went so far as had the power to dictate what type of economic system we have. That would constitute an economic winner. And then socially, they get to dictate culture and beliefs and behavior, normative behavior, etc. So at any rate, court historians, they praise Abraham Lincoln. They praise the winners, and in this case, the North, right? But number two tries to, and I try to do this quite often, is I try to pull a 180, just to get you to stay critical in what you read, okay, and the information that you come across. So with number two, with revisionist historiography, or the science and art of history, is revisionists want to revise that court history, and they want to they want to challenge it. And some even go so far as being kind of iconoclastic, right? Against everything held sacred in American history, kind of like South Park or something, right? And so they convey the fact that, or convey the opinion and image that Abraham Lincoln was a lukewarm hypocrite, predominantly concerned with saving the Union, and keeping the 11 and a half states in the Union, not to free the slaves. That the Northern public, the Northern Army, was not enthusiastic, did not enthusiastically embrace the mantle of crusaders against slavery. And look at some of the data that's presented here, some evidence of racism that existed in the North, that existed within the Northern Army. Well, that's ironic, right? If they're supposedly fighting a crusade to end slavery, why is that so? So it's messy. So take a look at number 2, and it's much more cynical, and that gives you context, again, as to, well, maybe at the end of the Civil War, maybe the North, maybe the Republican Party in particular, did not have the best interest of African Americans as its primary concern and number 1 priority. All right? And then remember also is you have the phenomenon of agency. Is African Americans didn't just passively have everything happen to them, whether they were victimized or something else. They had free will, as did everybody else, even if they weren't in positions holding levers of power and influence in society at their time period, and not allowed to, obviously. They still made decisions that mattered, and that still helped turn history in the direction in which it went. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind as well. So now numbers 3 and 4, what you're looking at is I tried to be very transparent with my titles on what I suggested as a very subjective, argumentative section. The federal government's zeal to change the South waned when the going got tough. And that says it all right there. So look at that and see how, for a moment, for an historical moment, arguably perhaps from 1866 to 1868, for those couple years, the North was in a very, using the parlance of that day, a very radical mood, if you will. They instituted some radical changes in the South. But it seems to have been somewhat of a short window. So why? What happened? Why did it wane? And in here, right, like I say in the title, look for evidence of things of them facing opposition, facing problems, and them not persevering and pretty much giving up. And Reconstruction, the forced Reconstruction at least, from the Republican Party of the South, seems to have ultimately failed, as evidenced, arguably, by the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s, having to, in some ways, virtually start over against Jim Crow laws, etc., that existed in the South 100 years later. So at any rate, that's something to keep in mind with number 3, should you choose number 3. And remember, I want you to demonstrate to me that you able to ascertain the thesis statement, the main argument that was being conveyed, and then be able to demonstrate, give an example or two of how that thesis in the section is being supported. And then thirdly, which is very subjective, is whether you agree or disagree with that said thesis. Okay? And please try to have it be a good half a page, your response that you submit. All right? And so then with number 4, Reconstruction failed because it didn't squash racism at its source. So what's being conveyed here is the argument that de jure change, right, change by law, only is superficial. It can only go so far. It has to bring about change de facto in reality, in people's day-to-day lives. And laws can't change, it seems, according to number 4, discriminatory, perhaps it can deter discriminatory behavior, but laws don't necessarily change hearts and minds, if you will. Okay? So think about that and see how the argument made at the end that there wasn't much of an attempt to encourage miscegenation, interethnic marriage and procreation, and social coexistence. There wasn't a lot of, teaching in the public school system of tolerance and pluralism, etc. And so hence the laws the laws brought about, the effect of deterring, outwardly stopping some discriminatory behavior in the South. But as soon as the fear of breaking the law ended, the discriminatory behavior just resurfaced immediately. All right, so something to think about. But I don't want to bore you. I want to just kind of briefly go through this. But according to the narrative, right, African Americans began forming union and liberty leagues. They left their plantations. They began joining the Union Army, following the Union Army. Some were promised by Union generals that they would get 40 acres and a mule, like Field Order number 15. Sherman and other leaders of the Northern Army at times promised the African Americans that because of the, allegedly because of years of unrequited labor, of working for no wages at all and having their wages stolen from them, that they had earned that. But the thing is, right, with land redistribution surfaces another component to the dialogue, to the present debate, that needs to be brought up, and that is the Southern argument that the Republican Party, the white Northern population, right, the federal government, including the Reconstruction era leaders of the Southern states, that they arguably did what they did for African Americans not out of the goodness of their heart, not out of humanitarianism, not being progressive, certainly not being egalitarian where they felt like they were on equal footing and no different from African Americans, but arguably to spite the white South, right? That what better way to punish the obstinate, stubborn South at the end of the war than to empower her African Americans at the expense of the white Southerners. So that's something to think about. There was an historian named William Dunning, Dunning, and he wrote a book on that. So it's become known thereafter as Dunning's thesis. But you have all that going on. The KKK is established. Downright racial violence just rises as an epidemic because, I don't want to say because I'm not equipped. I've read primary and secondary sources, but I think when you get into causation like that, it's so complex that I think you should be better versed than I in sociology and psychology and other social disciplines that we borrow from. But at any rate, commonly espoused is the argument that the white South felt angry and vindictive in losing the war to the North and being forced to give up slavery, but also a fear of empowerment of the very demographic that they had mistreated and subjugated and oppressed and marginalized for so many years. And so there was this great phobia that we need to keep the N-word down in his place. And so at any rate, Texas, South Carolina, there's just plenty of primary source evidence of a lot of white against black violence in the South at the end of and even after the Civil War. All right, so all this to contend with, right? And also note, right, that in the South, libertarianism was very strong. And, like John Stuart Mill, government don't tread on me, right? A fearful distrust of government, especially of centralized federal government, and a desire to be as independent or autonomous as an individual as possible. And the government should stay out of your business. So a lot of Southerners adhered to libertarianism. And so to some of them, in their own testimony, contended that they weren't fighting for a rich man's slaves to be kept by him, but that they were fighting so that Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia could decide for itself and not the federal government what to do about slavery, and also should decide in the western states that the people in the western states themselves ought to decide if they want slavery or not. And so, there are lots of different angles to consider. And then in the North also, you had like the Free Soilers and other groups and factions that contended that they just wanted jobs for white men. They didn't necessarily, they wanted to end slavery because they thought, and some in the Republican Party thought this, that slavery was inefficient. Because after all, right, you're not giving an incentive to your workers to work hard because you're not paying them. There's no incentive. And so at any rate, that those jobs on the plantations ought to be given instead, that slavery ought to be, prohibited and nullified, and that poor white farmers ought to be able to work as sharecroppers on the plantations instead, giving them a job, giving them an opportunity. So some Free Soilers and others who were against slavery and for the abolition of slavery weren't against it for the right reasons, according to today's worldview, right? It wasn't because of humanitarianism, etc. So that's important to note. But at the end of the war, Lincoln is killed, and Andrew Johnson takes over. And Andrew Johnson makes it very easy for the South to be reintegrated into the Union. And when Lincoln was going to do a very similar policy, he arguably, the benefit of the doubt was given him by the public and the press, that he was a kind man, a forgiving and gracious man, that he had proven his stripes and taking his stance against the extension of slavery, at any rate, prior to the Civil War, that he had shown his colors, and he had no more to prove. And so hence being lenient on the South at the end of the war was nothing further to be scrutinized than to just see it as a manifestation of how kind he was. But when it came to Andrew Johnson, it wasn't that way. Andrew Johnson was a very a racist man. I mean, just look at some of the primary sources. I have W.E.B. Du Bois, his writing on Reconstruction. Eric Foner, F-O-N-E-R, is a big historian on Reconstruction, highly reputable. And they have direct quotes from this guy that are not good, as far as him saying that, government, it's a white man, it ought to be a white man's government anywhere in the U.S., including in the South, including at the end of the Civil War, even after emancipation. But you think, okay, well, he was for emancipation, right? But as I mentioned, he could have been for emancipation, and very likely by his own words, for all the wrong reasons, wanting to give those jobs to poor white farmers instead. Because according to the quotes that I've read, he was very, kind of libertarian and conservative when it came to African Americans. He said, just leave them to their own devices. Make them pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. Okay, well, that's easy to say, but okay, what about legally entitling them and protecting their right to enter any trade that they want, to gain access to loans or credit, to be able to start businesses, to be able to purchase property or even rent property? Because in the South, they wouldn't allow that, with very few exceptions. Places like Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana, were exceptions to the rule, where they allowed grudgingly a free black community to do its thing within its own circles, of course, usually doing business and having clientele that were just fellow African Americans. And so at any rate, he didn't want any extra legal help or assistance given to the, quote, Negroes. He wanted to just let them fend for themselves, that freedom is good enough, and that's that. So kind of leaving them in a limbo stage, right? And you look at Rome, and you look at other civilizations, and they had like levels of citizenship, of enfranchisement or franchisement. just a fancy word for having the rights of an accepted citizen, the full rights of an accepted citizen of a state or country, right? You have the limited rights of economic autonomy, economic independence, to buy, sell, earn wages, right? Own property, get loans, be chartered to start a business, etc. And then you could just that alone have that and nothing else. Then you have perhaps a step above that is you have equal protection of the law, whereby you're entitled especially under criminal law, as opposed to civil, you're entitled to all the protections of full citizenship, so that you could take someone to court and sue him or her. If someone commits a crime against you, you're protected by the law. And so, equal protection of the law is arguably constitutes another higher level of acceptance into a society. And then, of course, you have suffrage. And suffrage, right, the right to participate politically in government, to vote in elections, to run for office, to hold office and serve as a politician or elected representative. That arguably is a whole other third step of franchisement or citizenship. And then arguably, perhaps beyond all of those, is social acceptance, right? It's one thing to grudgingly allow political and economic rights to a certain demographic, but to fully embrace them, to let your daughters marry their sons, to go and worship at the same church, to be buried next to them, to eat lunch at the same public accommodations as they. That's a whole other level as well. So all that needed to be considered, right? Like, where do you draw the line? To what extent was the South willing or going to be forced to accommodate African Americans? And the Republicans were far from being on the same page. You had everyone on the broad swath of the spectrum, and arguably on one side of the spectrum that I might call a minimalist would I subjectively label Andrew Johnson, the new president after Lincoln was killed. Just free them, and that's about it. Let them have certain basic economic rights, but even that, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was to grant them equal protection of the laws and just simply grant their right to have wages and access to property to be secured by law, and he vetoed it. The Freedmen's Bureau came down to adjudicate or referee disputes between black and white Southerners, came to give aid, immediate aid and food and clothing and shelter, and also education and legal defense to African Americans. He said that it was racist because it was there only to help African Americans and not the poor whites. So that's the type of guy that they're contending with as the new president now when Lincoln was killed. So when he made the South easily integrated back into the Union, it arguably, according to Eric Foner, the historian, it created a bitter taste in the mouth of Northerners and of Republicans. Like, okay, this guy is too friendly with the white South. He's making it too easy for them, right? And being too obstinate. Because remember that there was an expression, vote as you shot, right? That even people that are, by today's standards, very prejudiced against African Americans, they still felt as if it was necessary that the over 300,000 Northern or Yankee soldiers who died did not die in vain. And they would have considered it dying in vain if the South just returned to its before the war antebellum form. And so some wanted certain basic changes in rights for African Americans, not out of egalitarianism of believing that African Americans and white Americans were no different and one no better or superior to the other, but because they felt like too many lives had been lost. There needs to be some tangible change, right, in the South because of the sacrifice alone of so many Northern soldiers. So at any rate, the new governors that were appointed by the president, they were again, by today's standards, they were very racist. Many of them instituted black codes against African Americans, vagrancy laws. If you were found loitering on someone else's property, you were to be arrested and you'd have to pay a fine that they knew they couldn't, the African American ex-slaves or freedmen could not buy or could not pay. And they allowed a planter to pay the fee for them. Well, how convenient, right? And this made them back as slaves in all but name. They had laws, labor contract laws, whereby they deliberately limited the vocations that African Americans could engage in, and largely wanted to keep them out in the field working on the plantations. They needed their labor for that cotton. And so now they were trying to find semi-coercive, manipulative laws to keep them on the plantations. Apprenticeship laws for young boys especially, forcing them to work as apprentices, supposedly was the euphemism, for their old masters and planters. The Free State of Jones, I highly recommend that movie, you guys, if you haven't seen it. Covers a lot of this. So let's see here. They had no access to credit. They couldn't sell, purchase, or rent property in many cases. Like I said, they had to have labor contracts or they would be fined for that. And they oftentimes only had the opportunity of working in agricultural labor. And, look up debt peonage of the Spanish. That's very similar to what happened with these planters, keeping them indebted on their farms. So at any rate, let's see here. They were disenfranchised. They didn't have citizenship rights. They didn't have equal protection of the laws. They certainly didn't have suffrage right to participate in government. They were left out of employment of many industries. They were deprived of education. The Freedmen's Bureau had given them a taste of that, of black Southerners to be educated, and then they took that away. And then land that was redistributed to African Americans, like on Edisto Island, Edisto Island off South Carolina coast. Look that up. It's a fascinating story of African Americans trying to become subsistence or even cash crop farmers, being granted this land on this island and demonstrating to the world that the Sambo image of the happy-go-lucky, ignorant, lacking self-control African American was not true. Was just a erroneous stigma, and that they could be self-sufficient and disciplined and successful if given the basic opportunities to do such. So at any rate, anti-miscegenation laws against black and white marrying and having children, right, or cohabiting. Public congregation laws. They didn't want too many African Americans congregating in one area. They couldn't carry guns, and so forth and so forth. All right. So at any rate, let's see here. So then this is going to bring about a counter revolution, the radical Reconstruction phase, right? Whereby in the North, the 1866 congressional elections saw the election of enough radical Republicans, right, to be able to override the vetoes of President Andrew Johnson by a 2/3 supermajority, and to be able to pass whatever Congress wanted to despite the president. And that's what began to happen. And so it's known as Congressional Reconstruction. It's known as Radical Reconstruction. It's also known as Military Reconstruction, as you'll see in a moment. So at any rate, they'd had enough. And here's where I'm talking about on number 3, that zeal, that momentary zeal felt by the North, felt by the Republican Party, that things need to change, right? And so I'm not going to get into all the details of those, okay? I'm trying to spare you and not go too long here, but just give you the basics here. So at any rate, look at this, March 2nd, 1867 Reconstruction Act. They put the South into 5 military districts with military governors given power to declare martial law, shoot first and ask questions later, deprive people of citizenship. Union and black troops returned to the South. So now that it's occupied, the South, the southern states are occupied by military governors and troops as if they're back to war, right? They easily achieved 1/10 of the population seeking pardon to be reintegrated into the Union, and then simply have to say okay to the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. No longer was it so easy. Now, when they took the roll call of those states that made it back into the Union as states again so easily, under such easy criteria by President Johnson, they didn't read their names when they did roll call. And they said, no, you don't exist. You have to start from scratch. You're a territory again. Now they had to approve of the 14th Amendment. If they were stubborn about it, soon after came the 15th Amendment, and they had to okay that as well. The 14th Amendment was huge, right? In granting, it says here, simplifies, defines, and nationalizes citizenship requirements. Anyone born or naturalized, right? But look at this, Article 2 of the 14th Amendment. Oath violations. If you had declared an oath to defend the Constitution, that means any type of officer in the Union Army before the Civil War, right? At any level, any politician at any level, right? Swearing loyalty to the Constitution. If you had done that and then subsequently broke that oath and assisting the Confederacy, the rebellion during the Civil War, then you were stripped of your citizenship rights for 2 years. So now they're putting it to the white South, right? They're punishing them. Politically punishes non-enforcement. So representation in the House of Reps. So if they would not allow African Americans the right to vote, then those numbers couldn't be counted in counting how many reps they could send to Congress. So they were punished for doing so. But they went a step further from just simply punishing them, not allowing African Americans to vote, and demanding such in the 15th Amendment, right? Where they stated that the right of suffrage to participate in government is to be included under that clause of the 14th Amendment, that anyone born or naturalized is entitled to all the rights, protections, and privileges of citizenship. They said according to that amendment, a right, protection, or privilege of citizenship includes the right of suffrage, to vote and to run for office and to hold office. And it shall not be deprived of anyone on the basis of color or previous condition of servitude. There were 3 terms, I apologize, and I only mentioned 2. Let's see here. So now they're not messing around, right? And so what do you know? Under these new conventions, right, now forcing the African Americans to be able to vote, now you have an influx of African American politicians. I mean, my goodness, right? Some people literally, were not trying to use, a strategic exaggeration, hyperbole, when they said, like, the kingdom of God has come, like the second coming of Jesus. This was so dramatic, seeing some ex-slaves be able to serve as elected politicians at the local, state, and even federal level. Okay, so as mentioned before, there were it's in the handout. There were 16 congressmen, 600 state legislative assemblymen who were African American, constables, sheriffs, local judge positions, superintendents of education, secretaries of the Treasury, lieutenant governors, even a couple senators. Like, wow, right? And at first, amongst the African Americans, according to historian Foner, there was kind of a hierarchy amongst them, that those who tended to have sort of deference shown them by slaves, prior to emancipation, those who were already free, right? The quote, free Negroes. Because remember, manumission, as seldom as it happened, it did happen. So you had, that happened generations prior, and so generations now of people being born free as African Americans or biracial. And so at any rate, there was kind of a deference toward that demographic. Also preachers and others who had kind of a monopoly on social deference, of people looking up to them, looking to them for leadership, encouragement, comfort, etc. So preachers, store clerk owners, and small scale entrepreneurs, free black business owners, etc. Black soldiers, ex-soldiers who had had the chance to fight in the Civil War, like the 54th Regiment, right, of Massachusetts, of black soldiers. They're able to, easily win the confidence of their peers. But what Foner contends is by 68, after a couple years, that it morphed into something more revolutionary in the sense of the demographic of those elected as black politicians. A much higher proportion began to be elected as ex-slaves, many of whom were not even literate. I'm looking at this on page 403 in W.E.B. Du Bois' History of Reconstruction, right? He says, Negroes were conspicuous members of the legislators. There was a large proportion of former slaves, and at first perhaps 2/3 of them could not even write. But by 1871, most of them had learned at least to read and to write. Many of them became speakers of force and eloquence, while others were silent or crude. In the Senate, it was said that some of the colored members spoke exceedingly well, with great ease and the grace of manners. And so at any rate, Robert Elliott, Robert Smalls, Francis Cardoso, Hiram Revels, Blanche K. Bruce, James Lynch. There's just some African-American politicians who developed a very reputable reputation at this time. And even from racist white people, contemporaries, writing well of them, right? So then practical issues and so forth. Well, let's see here. Let's just jump right to the next one because it's a little bit redundant if I don't. But notice this. Oops, not yet. And I'll put this online, okay? So Reconstruction successes, right? They developed to a certain extent a, quote, New South, as was the expression of that day. Infrastructure helped develop with railroad and telegraph wire communications, road cultivations, canals, etc. Entrepreneurial pursuit of more people opening businesses and receiving business charters and getting access to loans and credit to be able to do such. Diversification, not just simply the cash crops of cotton, tobacco, and rice and indigo, but now they developed metallurgy, metallurgical products, and clothing, textiles took off in the South, and other industries finally developed. Education, they developed public school educations, right? And then also they developed the welfare state with orphanages, psychological asylums, penitentiary systems, right? Almshouses for the homeless. A lot of kind of safety net legislation and institutions were created by some African American. Now remember, African Americans did not constitute the majority of congressmen at any time, lower or upper house. They did not constitute the majority of governors. There's scarcely a governor amongst them. They did not constitute even the majority of the state legislature, with the exception, if my memory serves me correctly, of South Carolina alone, and of certain districts at the local level in the famous Black Belt of Mississippi. Only in those areas and in certain areas around New Orleans and in Louisiana did African Americans at the local and with South Carolina, the state level, did they constitute the majority of citizens, right? And elected reps. And so that's important to remember when I say they did this or they did that, right? Carpetbaggers, the demographic of northern Yankee white immigrants going down into the South, they were seen by the Southerners and the Southern press as parasites coming down to enrich themselves over the broken, prostrate South. But you know, it's hard. You know, from election to election, it's hard to generalize just how large of the contingency of politicians they made up. Okay, and then you also had scalawags, right? Southern whites who chose the Republican Party, the party against slavery, and they were seen as, of course, traitors to a lot of the you know, conservative and racist white Southerners of their time period. So it was known as the hated triumvirate. They arguably had a big influence over the state governments for a few years in the late 1860s, but I think it could easily get exaggerated. But they did participate in these developments of a new South, of modernizing the South, if you will. And they instituted public school systems. And they meant for them to be integrated, black and white, and they just experienced white flight. The white parents refused to allow their white kids to go to school with black children, almost without exception. So sadly, though, that was a limited success. Limited political, economic, and even social coexistence. There were enough lawsuits, for instance, you know, because they did away with the black codes in virtually every southern state during Reconstruction. And so there were enough lawsuits that it kind of deterred white business owners and public accommodation bosses from discriminating. And so you had even limited social coexistence between black and white for a time period here during Reconstruction in the South. Like, wow, right? Just a generation before, the blacks were enslaved or absolutely marginalized in these small little island parts of cities like Charleston and New Orleans. And that's as good as it got for them. Now they're participating in government and they're helping institute all this stuff. It's amazing. Enhanced African American agency. This collectively enhanced the self-esteem of African Americans, arguably. And when you look at fraternal organizations like church, especially, and other you know, fraternal organizations and political organizations, the African Americans organized in larger and larger numbers throughout this period, so that it was arguably, you know, collectively enhancing their self-esteem to be able to help dictate their own terms, right? And help make a difference in their society. However, right, the oppositional press got a hold of this. Look at number 3 and see how they blamed the, quote, Negroes and carpetbaggers for the corruption of the time period. And I don't know how much I want to get into this because I have some of it, I have it written out, an explanation for it on number 3 in that section. But take a look and see how that's not fair, that they pretty much scapegoated African Americans for the corruption that was happening at that time. I mean, for one, right, with corruption is with this new welfare state, those things cost money. Public schools, orphanages, asylums, penitentiaries, etc., right? Almshouses for the homeless. That all costs money. And then people got angry when they got further in debt or when they had to get loans from Yankee bankers or they engaged in inflationary printing. It's like they couldn't win in trying to resolve the issue of spending alone for this new kind of welfare state that was being established in the southern states at this time. And then also graft was rampant everywhere, right? Whereby, you know, graft and bribery, whereby, okay, you need a railroad to go through your town, So you find a company, a corporation that you're willing to accept a contract with, right? And dictate to them where the tracks can be and cannot be. But how do you choose, right? What if they're offering you bribes, saying choose me as the railroad instead of this other corporation, etc. And so, especially things for the public interest like railroads, it was very enticing to be able to accept a bribe. And then once you found out, right, a certain area of the city, of the state where the railroad was going to exist, we'll get to this soon with the Transcontinental Railroad, you would know that the development that would come as a supplement to its establishment, that there would be so much business, so much trade going on along the tracks of the railroad, that it would greatly enhance the property value of the land on either side of the railroad tracks, etc., right? So hence you get insider information about where the railroad's going to be established. And it was tempting, not for yourself, or at least maybe for your brother or cousin or friend, to tell that person and give that inside information to that person, so he or she could beat the public in purchasing that valuable land, and so that they could sell that land to the railroad corporation and state. Trying to get bond certificates and being offered stock in railroads in quid pro quo fashion, like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, happen quite often. We'll see. This happened so often, you guys, in the 1870s, that, Mark Twain called it the Gilded Age. He likened it to something that was corroded but simply had a glittery facade over the top of it. So at any rate, there was also, 12 years is a long time to maintain the public's interest in anything. So 12 years went and passed, and you have issues with the Native Americans, with the Indian Wars in the West, the Transcontinental Railroad, the Chinese and Hispanics, and issues with the cattle ranchers and the cattle wars. You have Gilded Age robber baron issues, crime in the northeastern cities. All kinds of stuff is going on in order to elicit interest in other things other than the South. So the North kind of began to lose interest in what was going on in the South. The press was blaming the black people for everything that had been gone wrong with misgovernment and corruption. Citizenship returned, right, to those who had been disfranchised for 2 years. Those 2 years lapsed, and they had a good experience at political organization. And not to mention, they used outright terror. The Ku Klux Klan and Knights of Camellia later, and other organizations terrorized African Americans who went to try to vote on election days, etc., or run for office. And then failure of white and black Republicans to unite. They didn't circle the wagons against the white Southern Democrats, and they needed to. They could have used their numbers, but instead they both made separate deals with the white Democrats, etc., to save their own skin, or had their own priorities. And so the black Republicans just didn't have enough allies. They didn't maintain enough allies in the South to stay on top politically. And then ultimately the Compromise of 1877, Presidential Rutherford B. Hayes promised to leave the South, to evacuate the troops from the South if he were chosen by the House of Reps as the next president. And then thus ensued the takeover of the antebellum, at least, not literally the same generation, but the antebellum elite and form of things. And so Jim Crow laws were established, and it was as if in the civil rights movement subsequently in the 1950s and 60s, almost as if they had to start all over. And so in a sense, Reconstruction failed. All right, so thank you. I wish you well. I hope this video helped. Hang in there, okay? And I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.